Next speaker is David Lewis, who a lot of you know because he's here a lot. But he's a founding principal of Tsurumaki Lewis, LTL Architects, and an associate professor here where he directs the famous design workshop in the Masters of Architecture program. Again, there's a very long list, but I'll go through only a couple. A long list of very impressive distinctions that David carries. They're received the 2007 National Design Award for Interior Design from the Smithsonian Cooper Hewitt National Design Museum. LTL Architects represented the U.S. in the 2004 Venice Architecture Biennale. And very recently, LTL Architects was selected by the Museum of Modern Art here in New York to execute a design proposal for the exhibition Rising Currents, which opened last week and on display now. So we all encourage you to go see that. David is also a co-author of 2 books and has taught at many esteemed universities, is the founding member of the advisory board of the School of Architecture at the University of Limerick in Ireland, and he's on the board of trustees for the Van Allen Institute. David's drawings and LTL's drawings are in the permanent collections of the San Francisco MoMA and the Carnegie Museum of Art. Let me welcome David Lewis. Thank you for coming.
This is the office of LTL Lewis, Tsurumaki Lewis, which I share with 2 other partners. And what I'm going to try to present today is looking at a couple different projects at actually radically different scales to kind of get at this question of is it possible to establish a methodology for work, particularly work within the interiors, that really tries to bridge between the different questions and conditions that are framed by very different projects. We've been, as an office, involved in a whole series of different work, and we actually intentionally don't specialize in one thing or another. So we've been involved from everything from speculative projects to installations to more typical ground-up architectural projects to transformations of existing interior shells. And it's the latter of which I'm going to focus on today. But it's driven really by a very consistent, we hope a very consistent methodology that's also relatively flexible. And this methodology is essentially framed by a real focus upon looking at what are the givens or the constraints of any given project. In other words, what are the rules of the game of a particular assignment. And this isn't just sort of a quick catalog, but actually a pretty complex inventory of what are the things that are at stake, but also more importantly, what are the things that you need to take into consideration even before drawing the first line. The next is then try to figure out actually how to turn those constraints into the design project. In other words, how to catalyze those constraints. And really try to find what we are interested in is often the productive paradox at the heart of the project. In other words, instead of seeing this as a kind of a form meets function where you have a singular function and you determine a form, we're actually much more interested in the constraints that are actually at play and in contrasting conditions within a particular project and try to turn those into the design trajectory, ultimately producing essentially a series of opportunistic overlaps, producing projects that are effectively called multivalent, have a kind of multivalent performance to them. And let me try to explain what I mean by this by looking much more specifically at a small project so it's very discrete and very explicit. And this comes out of a series of 6 restaurants that we've did in New York over the last couple of years, all of them framed by the fundamental or basic constraint of doing a restaurant in New York, namely the shell is usually given, it's really small, the client, the restaurateur wants to maximize profit, which means put as many butts on seats as you possibly can and turn as many tables if possible, depending on the layout of the restaurant. Make sure it's absolutely efficient in its layout, that it meets code, and more importantly, that you have a very dictated set of time parameters you're working within. The real question then is, what's left for design? In other words, if you've executed this project to meet those constraints only, you end up with a kind of obligation of surface. But we see this actually as the real opportunity. How do you actually take that, what is left over after the kind of efficiency of the plan arranged and dictated by the economics of the restaurant industry, how do you actually turn that into the very design trajectory. In other words, what we call in this project, Fluff Bakery, the seductive surface. Not just a wall or a ceiling, but something that actually merges between them. And think about the material condition of the building of that surface, not the application of the surface, but the building of that surface as integral to the design process. In this case, using felt, a leitmotif for the symposium, but in this case, industrial felt of 3 different hardnesses, the white being the hardest, the darkest being the softest, and 3 different painted Baltic birch plywood, laid them up equivalent to a kind of brick tapestry to essentially build a thickened surface in which the distinction between wall and ceiling is invisible. What you're looking at is both the ceiling and the wall in this project. The surface goes from darker at the bottom to lighter up above to deal both with cleanliness but also deal with the visual transformation of the space. So it looks actually much taller than it actually is by the way in which you manipulate the percentages of dark and light felt, dark and light wood. It's also an incredibly acoustic material, so it pulls in the sound so that this one surface, not just being one thing, becomes in fact the multivalent performance of the space, transforming what is otherwise an efficient plan and layout, in this case a coffee and bakery where you can come in quickly, get your food, and then sit down on the sides. But actually the whole thing gets built in, even to the extent that the walls turn down and become the benches. Throughout the whole thing, then we want another sense of kind of delight moving through. In this case, a series of custom-built Auditorium linear incandescents off of 3/4-inch stainless steel pipe, all pulled across to produce the kind of illumination, but also a kind of horizontal chandelier within the spatial conditions of the project. This returns then to the original driving condition and constraint of the project, which was it had to attract people off the street. In other words, pull people in. So this kind of jump into hyperspace look of the Fluff Bakery was intentional to pull your eye, capture you, and to in fact frame both the surface on the outside. You can see the surface is articulated into the window and the entranceway framed as a way of integrating and negotiating the relationship between the exterior street, publicly owned, and the private, or in this case, the commercial venue behind. On another project, just to show how this sort of focus upon kind of the givens or the constraints plays out, this is a restaurant in which we knew a couple things starting out. One, it was going to be called Tides. 2, they were going to use bamboo skewers in the cooking of seafood primarily. And 3, that the building was relatively small, such that when you built in the booths on the left-hand side, which had to be raised up because you had an entranceway to the basement to the left, namely this here, so that when you actually had to put in the banquette to the right, and the booths to the left, you ended up with a space that was taller than it was wide. So the greatest opportunity then was to work on the ceiling. So we basically bought 110,000 bamboo skewers of 3 different types, of 3 different lengths, put them in individually into a series of foam pieces, essentially industrial acoustic foam that then matches, as you can see on the plan, a kind of grid layout, each of them with a different orientation, tilt, and height to ultimately create a tidal condition so that the entire project on the ceiling reflects essentially the New Jersey tidal wetlands. We're also particularly interested in the inherent paradox of the project, which is you're taking an incredibly hard, sharp material used to skewer through fish to be able to create this kind of fur-like, soft-like surface on the ceiling, creating a kind of oscillation between the expectations of tactility perceived as the individual to its aggregation as a complex component into a whole. So as a result, you end up immediately coming into the space not recognizing that it's really narrow because of the requirements of the program, but actually recognizing the kind of expanse of the ceiling and the delight in the scale oscillation that occurs between the individual and the collective, as well as the way in which it goes down on the cones of silence that are built over each of the booths. The real challenge then is this may seem fine for a project that's approximately, I think, 600 square feet. What do you do when you're working on a project that is a little bit larger? This is the buffet at MGM City Center, which was just opened in December, and it's about 16,700,000 square feet. Just to give you a sense, for those of you that don't know the City Center project, we weren't designing the whole thing, by the way, so I'll get to that in a second. What you see in the Google Earth shot, highlighted in purple being the SketchUp models that are dropped in, is the size of the complex. It is intentionally called City Center, even though the center of Las Vegas is off and up to the left, to the north, pretty sizably. It has 5 major towers. It literally is 16 million square feet built in 5 years at the cost of $11 billion. The challenge then of the project, and we were one of the many designers brought into this project, was we were asked to design the all-you-can-eat buffet located right there. One of the spectacular things about the siting of this is that it's directly, and you can see it, it's the one that's illuminated in that space. It's directly connected to the pool and facing to the west. The challenge, though, is how do you take the buffet, which is usually broken into these sort of 2 primary areas, the idea of getting as much food as possible at the food trough and moving to the horizontal feed zone, and to turn that actually into the driving condition of the project. How do you take this? This is the programmatic requirement of the buffet, which is a critical component of the casino because of the way in which it plays with time, the way in which it deals with the capacities that are necessary. In this case, they had anticipated that we were going to make something that would have 600 seats and serve at a maximum 6,000 people during a typical day. This is 1/5 of the plan of MGM City Center. All right. The project we were asked to do, and just to give you a quick sense, this is the main casino floor down here. The pool area is up to the upper side. You have the banquette of elevators drop off on the 2 circles for automobile drop off as it comes in. We were located right there, right in the center, off to the pool, at roughly a 25,000 square foot space, which if you look at the percentage to the MGM project, it's a 0.001% of the total size of the project. Even though it's going to seat 600 people, twice the size of the School of Constructed Environments. All right. What we were given, though, was this: horizontal floor plate, section. All right. Roughly about 20 feet, mechanical space up here, and an open area that we had to negotiate. The first thing, though, is to try to figure out, given this seemingly blank condition, what are the constraints? What are the opportunities? What are the particularities of this project that you can exploit and turn into the challenge to be able to reorganize the buffet? In this case, the fact that it was actually going to be viewed to the outside was critical. All right, most buffets are buried in the basement where they have no daylight. This one was going to have active daylight, particularly because it was looking out over the pool. So that all of a sudden sets up a condition where you have a western pool view, you have an entry area, and then you have this the challenge, which is it's much longer this way than it is that way. And so how do you get access to the back of house, which is up to the north, to be able to tie into the action stations or the food troughs? How do you get those to be able to organize so that the space works and flows? But more importantly, how do you actually build the space in such a way that it doesn't produce this horizontal expanse of 25,000 square feet and creates actually a dining area that you'd want to dine in, not simply because you need to feed? So the challenge then, to be able to maximize the number of seats, was that we basically sculpted a floor dealing with built-in banquettes and sculpted a ceiling that would play together, essentially designing the buffet, which is typically organized in plan, as you see here, efficiently setting up the action stations all the way around the perimeter so that you pull into a line and it's a really clear line, But more importantly, you established a series of individual rooms within the overall room, while at the same time creating a complete clear view so that everyone has view out to the pool or out to the windows to the daylight. This essentially means that you're designing in section, but that the ceiling and the floor cannot touch. They have to hold a kind of tension point between them that is the point of eye height of someone walking through, negotiated very differently when you sit down within the space. This was done by essentially taking a ceiling panel that drops down, a bamboo plywood a banquette that lifts up, providing a kind of sculpted topography both of floor and of ceiling. Right? Within the designs, very open if you look this direction, so that you get this sense of the expanse of this fairly sizable space. But if you rotate 90 degrees, all of a sudden those things begin to close down, creating the sense of a much smaller restaurant within a restaurant. Essentially, you have a series of individual restaurant seating areas within the total space. And this is the project as it was opened middle of December. And it's one in which you do, the key here is to try to pull your eye up to the ceiling so that you get the sense of delight, while at the same time have the sense of view to the outside. And pulled, looking at 90 degrees, the rooms become much smaller. You still constantly have that view to the outside. As you're walking down the corridors, because there's a lot of walking action to be able to get to the action stations, there's the sense of an intimate space that are off of the path of travel, so that you're not walking through, which is often one of the problems of the buffets, is that they pack so many chairs in. You don't know where you're actually supposed to go to be able to go to your chair to get the different seafood, and the food is spectacular. I mean, this is not low-grade, all-you-can-eat brown chicken. It's actually pretty. It's intended to be a high-end buffet. So ultimately, that you end up getting this space that is essentially a series of nested rooms within the overall volume, with clear view to the action station, so you can see where you want to go for the next course. And in order to make this happen, though, we looked at a couple things in detail, and one of those was looking pretty aggressively at the lighting system, not simply as a point of illumination, but a point of delight. And this was working with Derek Porter Studios and Nelson Jenkins of Luminarc, both of which are at Parsons, as a collaboration, to really try to rethink the ceiling topography as its own sculptural terrain. All right? So it's not simply the white panels pulling down to create a kind of spatial condition, but actually is producing a material surface. And these were done through two very different things. One was the illumination of the white panels that you see here, but it's also a series of Milky Ways that would move through. That would essentially produce a kind of cross-graining of the light. On one hand, the sort of white panels were all to be backlit with a series of discs cut in, so that those discs would be kind of a series of light points all the way through the space. And as the things raked down, you'd get the oblique condition of that circle, reinforcing the sense that that ceiling terrain dives down at an angle. The other was the introduction of a series of chandeliers, basically a cylindrical disc, the exact same size of the holes that were in the white panel, the illuminations in the white panel, as though they had been able to penetrate through the white panel in the zones between the different ribbons of the project. This is a shot on the mock-up, and these are the shots of the actual project. These are all lit from above with a series of 3 LEDs, capturing then the cut end of the Pyrex tube. These are all glass. So that you get this sort of oscillation between the one, which is the illuminated panel, the other being the chandelier, and the third being the piece that's actually providing most of the light, which is the drop pieces that are pulled down from the ceiling panel. The reason this is really important is that when you sit down in the banquette, your head is below the height of the banquette, so that your primary view, beside the person that you're eating with, is looking up at the ceiling. So that the ceiling topography becomes an incredibly important surface, not just for efficiencies of sprinkler systems and alarms, but actually for the understanding of the way in which the eye works between the surface, the detail, and the overall. The other was trying to look at the material conditions of the project, trying to essentially challenge the vaguest tendency to be able to treat materials as a manipulatable thing to produce a series of formal devices. We're actually interested in the material treatments for the material properties themselves. In other words, see if we can't play up the kind of material richness, not in service of the production of something else, whether it be a giant unicorn or some giant head of a pharaoh who had been dead over 3,000 years, brought to life in Las Vegas. We're actually more interested in the material conditions that would be available. In this case, the material palettes we presented were really rich and dark, much more earth tone on the ground and much more lighter as they went to the ceiling, with the one piece of really distinct color being the organizing principles of the action stations. And this is a ribbon that starts from the entrance as you come to the line, pulls all the way around, and wraps as you move all the way across, as a gradient from essentially green all the way to the orange. And this gradient was created through basically 36 different types of colored glass tile, grouped into very different arrangements. So you go from the one collection to the grouping of 2 to the grouping of 5, so that you get a scale transformation even within the material condition as you move around. So as you're waiting on the outside line, this begins as a kind of glass treatment with a series of embedded LED monitors to animate and to pass the time as you're waiting for getting your seat in the buffet. The material here then produces a kind of introduction to what you then find on the action stations as you move around. And that you can begin to see the change here from the individuals at this point to the more collective ones, so that scale change is constantly breathing as you move through the space, ultimately moving across to become a kind of orange glow with the subtle changes mapped all the way across from one side to the next. Ultimately, what we're really interested in was trying to figure out a kind of working within the interior condition of the project to produce essentially a landscape. Because the site itself was so large, it required that kind of approach to the treatment of surface, mostly the treatment of the sky and the treatment of the ground, but precisely because it was located in a place you could have dinner and still be in the dinner within the sunlight, which is pretty unusual within Las Vegas. I found this actually on Flickr, which I thought was a kind of a nice little summary, which was written by Vixen Lee Venomous. It says, "I really like the glass tube lights coming down from the ceiling. This restaurant had a little bit of irony from what I can tell. It was called The Buffet." But as we walked past, it actually looked like a fine dining sit-down restaurant, which in some ways was the proof that you can take this program, make it still work from a kind of efficiency standpoint, but also challenge the kind of negative connotations that become these sort of horizontal plates to produce through the manipulation of the interior by thinking about it in an expansive way, a recalibration of the way in which one would occupy that space, particularly for the act of dining. The last project I want to show essentially expands upon this issue of the relationship between the body, site, and essentially embodied site and surfaces, but now with the challenge that would be typically given to a sculptor or an artist. And this was the lobby wall sculpture project from the Memorial Sloan Kettering, which is still under construction. And the challenge we were asked to take on was this one wall in the Skidmore, Owings & Merrill building, as you can see in the middle there, and effectively right here in section, was to be a place for art. It has 2 structural columns moving up it, and that's all that we knew. So we were asked to essentially say, make a lobby art piece. And what we were interested in doing is, well, how can we make an art piece that actually talks more about the nature of the lobby than it does about the piece itself as an object? In other words, how can the object be truly an interactive piece, even though the idea of touching it was not something that they necessarily wanted? The first thing we did was do a kind of speculative map and plan of the greatest intensities of use and movement as one goes through the space, namely at the front entrance, the entrance to the auditorium, and the entrance to the theater space. Map those hypothetically based upon an average of eye heights, turn those into a series of cones of vision projected against the lobby wall in a Rhino model, such that you took an initial grid for all the projections, recognizing that the cone, as it hits on the oblique against that surface, produces a very distorted circle down to an ellipse, creating essentially a wall that would be broken up with a front surface as a grid and a back surface, the resultant of that grid of the projections against the surface, anticipating building it out of a series, essentially 526 boxes, so that you have, at one point, a recognition on the front of a kind of normal rational grid. On the back side, the sort of resultant of that grid, now understanding the relationship to the way the view cones were taken within the lobby space itself. Each of these boxes was then cut essentially to provide a kind of material or mass by which the optical view would be essentially materialized, made physical within the space, creating then this as a kind of design concept. The real challenge in this project wasn't necessarily the generating of this, but it was actually the building of it. Like, how do you build this piece, which on a kind of digital or conceptual level can be relatively easily worked out? And the real challenge there is that if you take each of these cones, hypothetically taken, based upon densities and eye heights, projected against the walls, you get a series of radically different cones. Or cubes that have very different structural properties. Everything from the dark gray, which is perfectly fine, to the one that might have potential sagging because it has its two sides cut out, to the one that's only supported on one side, so it might even sag even more, to the one that is typical within design studios, which is you get the dropout, the fantasy, non-gravity supported floating piece in the middle, perfectly well in Rhino, not exactly well in the real world. So we ended up having to go through the project and map every single one of the projects, every one of the cubes, and turn them all effectively through a fairly slow iterative process so that they would all be gray. So the front had more problems towards the middle. On the back, that gets scattered as you move across. Working with Vaco out of Philadelphia, who basically had these built out of stainless steel, essentially erected a jig, and the jig was there to do a full continuous stainless steel weld. It's an aluminum jig, so it would basically suck all the heat from the welding property so you wouldn't deform the surface of the stainless steel, because if the heat sits there, it's going to deform and you're not going to get a tight piece. The problem, of course, you can see it in the middle, is that when the stainless steel cools, it shrinks. It's going to shrink back down onto the jig, so the only way to get these things off the jig was to use a pneumatic punch that would basically pop each of these things off of the jig as they're welded. It was roughly 10 linear miles of stainless steel welding to weld the entire project together. We did test samples in the shop to really figure out what the light on the inside, in this case it's super fluorescent yellow, to be able to bounce around the light on the inside. Had an opportunity to mock it up in a gallery in Philadelphia, and it was done in basically about 3 hours using a forklift, so that ultimately what you end up getting is a piece on the front that is a registration of the kind of rationality of the control of the views, but on the back a kind of breakdown of that rationality, a kind of absurdist proposition driven from a rational logic. And it's the juxtaposition of these two things that ultimately come about because you're looking at the spatial condition of the lobby that drives the design. So what you end up getting is a project that if you look at it on oblique, you can see through certain holes, but other holes you can't. So that what we found even in the gallery is that people would come in, they'd look really closely, try to determine this kind of Piranesi-like interior space of the interior of the lobby piece, or the lobby art wall, but the piece is itself really about dictating and activating movement around it. That it's about walking through, trying to find the holes, and at the moment that you see the holes, you realize that the piece is actually looking back at you. And that for us is really critical when you're looking at the nature of the interior space, is to understand that there's constant movement, activity within it, and that the scale of the human has to be related to the environment that it's constructed, both optically but also in the most multivalent performances from questions of sound, questions of touch, questions of light. And I hope that helps the conversation.